There's death and life of fiction in the title of the exhibition. One of the ways I'd like to see that understood is that we're trying to read fiction and reality symmetrically. That doesn't mean there's a symmetry between the two, but only when you are finding the symmetry point, you can cross. You can read fiction back on reality. You can read reality back into fiction. Reading reality back into fiction means to mobilize it, means to make it unnormal, means to monster it, to start to imagine it differently. It means to test the limits of the possible. Reading fiction back into reality sees that fiction is also a way of escaping. Neither reality is real nor fiction is fictitious. So the whole idea of this death and life of fiction is to say that we need to permanently read both ways. We need to open a two-way street, death and life of fiction. Without fiction, life is dead, because we can't move anymore anywhere. We cannot imagine anything anymore. In fiction, life similarly dies, because you have run away from it. So there is no purity of each. So I think when you go through the exhibition, you will see that the artist, this is not an exhibition mostly of documentary or fictitious words, like where it is absolutely unstable. So I spoke about the monster as a figure of the border, meaning we have to see that any story of progress is also a story of destruction. And only if you find the point of symmetry between these two, you can find the point of asymmetry, where ultimately destruction takes over from any progress, or where destruction is the mythology of progress itself. And that's the birth of a monster. That means that all monsters have always to do with crossing, in most cases illegitimately so, borders, existing divisions. There can be national borders, borders of any kind of social club, if you will, or there can be borders purely of conceptual distinctions, which are never only purely conceptual. All this is important because there are divisions that produce hierarchies, and they produce the particular form of modern monstrosity, which is that modernity locks its opposites. First, it produces its opposites as monsters, and then it locks them in, it entraps them. It means that it creates a matrix in which the other of modernity is always already part of modernity as its other, in the sense that when it fights against monsters, they become only bigger. Or to say that any logic of division is a very strange mirror economy. The exhibition, you could say, is hence a program of attempting to demonster modern unmonstering modernity. comes from the Turner Diaries, which is kind of quintessential Bible of racism. It's a fictional novel describing a war of the white race against anything impure. That's an ultimate war of the idea of purity here, monsters everywhere else. Of course, in the moment you think that purity exists, you have become the monster. The question of how do we fight evil without becoming it? Wang Dawei's description of the 20th century logic, because it's in reality it's a kind of economy of violence and fiction that he writes, then it is very difficult to maintain that symmetry between negative and positive, because we clearly see that the negative is a tsunami, that every little positive is overwhelmed by a tsunami of negative. So this disproportion, how do you write the history of that? This is the question. And I think art can teach us a lot of this. On the imaginary conceptual side, first to bring things into symmetry in order to measure the actual asymmetry. If you are on the side of power, you don't see the asymmetry. The monster, the Tao Wu that Wang Dawei speaks about, which is that thing that operates the reversal at the border, according to which you become the evil or more evil than what you fight. This is the Tao Wu operation. Freedom becomes the greater imprisonment, systemic imprisonment, faceless imprisonment. So we need to confront this history and be precise about it, because the ability to recover this sense of how do we say no to systems depends on it. But here we have a strange incident of projection, of fiction, mythology as fiction, and fiction of what is beyond the known. This is Xingtian, right? The monster whose head was cut off, but he wouldn't stop fighting. From the Shanhai Jing, this Lu Xun loved this one the most. In the marvels of the East, which is this strange medieval European publications that speak about the world that lies beyond their knowledge. No? And they always say that there's monsters and monstrous human races, such as people with only one eye or people without head. So look at this. This is from the year 1040, medieval illustration. And it is just like Xintian. And this is what Europeans were made to believe lives in China. Action. So here we have a death and life of fiction reversal. Very interestingly, it is a modern contemporary depiction of Xintian. Here, important for instance, that Xintian here is turned on its head, holds their own basket for his blood. This is sort of the doubling of the monstrosity, this mirroring to upside down. History and decapitation, of course, the guillotine is a famous motive of writing revolutionary history. Turning the world upside down, you need the guillotine. Mini museums is one way to create a sort of separation between artistic projects that in their own articulation remain autonomous, while the mini museums are clearly meditations with documents or playing with documents on the institution that is the framing condition, right? So moving between the frame and the content, the figure and the ground is a theme, permanent theme in this exhibition. The mini museums are functioning like containers of where meaning is precise, but that means that the work have to be less precise, because many works are dead when you try to pin them down to one meaning. That means they can have all metaphorical freedom. That means, maybe this, maybe that. The monster is never pinned down, right? Monstrosity has this face, that face. So it's incredibly important that there is no face. The Museum of the Monster, that is history. One way of describing this museum is to say that evil in modernity is systemic and faceless. So don't expect the picture of Hitler as the embodiment of modern evil, even though he serves it so well. It is more important to think about the structure and the millions of bureaucrats and the weapons, etc., that made Hitler possible. It's more important to think about the ground than about the figure. The Museum of Crossing, after the Museum of Monster, that is history, makes a complete 180-degree turn. It says, while in the Museum of Crossing, the border seems almost necessary. The continuity of modernity is this acceptance of its borders must be defended with the ultimate means. And this history is linear. It has led to the nuclear bomb. And this is why there's the weapons of mass destruction story is so important. Because that is linear progress, destruction. The Museum of Crossing says the opposite. It says like, monsters are not the exception, they are the norm. And those who believe that they are the exception are the monsters. The Museum of Crossing says we have to invert this model of thinking of borders. We have to say that borders are absolutely abnormal. They are fictional, phantasmatic projects. They are never real. They are very real in their effects, but they are fiction. This is in this death and life of fiction. So there's a very simple sort of exposé that then leads to all the other statements in the third floor to the Museum of Rhythm and so on. It's exposé. So the basic inversion we have to do is to say that monsters are the most normal thing. What kind of monsters? Those hybrids, those border-crossing figures that logic of division calls monsters. Let's stop calling them monsters, let's call them normality, and those who think division is normal, let's call them monsters. No? This reversal is crucial. Because nothing exists in purity, nothing exists in division. Everything is in permanent hybridity and flux. There is a challenge of trying to find a modern language for modern history of how what it means to be situated in that, what it means to be a border figure, to always switch between these things, because we are always both connecting and dividing. So with all fictions, we need to re-find their references where they lost their real references. In a way, we need to reconquer this mythological project, but under modern circumstances, without bracketing modernity away, or without saying that mythology is always the anti-modern. The opposite, the most mythological project is modernity. It produces monstrous mythologies in which we are ultimately caught. Why monstrous? Because we don't even know anymore that it's mythology. Mythology is the way we produce negotiation with the conditions in which we live and where they come from, origins. Crossing the death and life of fiction two-way is the principal formula for mythologies. What is a common experience of modernity? And to experience the monstrosity of modernity as violence that comes in the name of rationality is something that is a global experience. Taiwan has a unique ability to question this logic because nothing of this here is taken for granted. There's none of this is just normality. It's open, it's an open question. That way it's a little bit like trying to update on a level of, now let's say 100 years later, after Kafka and Lushin, how do we talk about that underside of modernity?